Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're in uncharted waters in many respects, particularly when it comes to trade. It's really difficult to analyze what's happening given the rapidity and severity of changes hour by hour, especially when it comes to our biggest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, as well as China, another significant relationship for the United States. To sift through all of this, we invited a longtime friend who is a unique expert in all of these issues. Ambassador Demetrios Marantis is the former Deputy United States Trade Representative. He served under President Obama from 2009 until 2013. He was responsible for trade policy and enforcement in both Asia and Africa. He also served as the Chief International Trade Counsel for the Senate Finance Committee. He led Square's international government relations team and was most recently SVP for global government relations for Visa. He brings really unique experience as a trade negotiator, a policy expert, and a business person. And I am hopeful that this conversation will be as helpful to you as it was to me in understanding strategic thinking and implications behind a wide range of changing policy. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoy this show. Welcome back to Good Revenue. I am super excited about today's episode. We have a very distinguished guest with us today. It's Ambassador Demetrios Marantis, just generally one of my favorite people to talk to about trade and policy. So welcome, Demetrios. We're so happy to have you.
I'm so happy to be here.
It is a pleasure. When we first talked about this, we were talking about all of the possibilities. And as we're recording, we're in the middle of this completely bananas trade war, to use a technical term. And so our caveat, obviously everything may be wrong or different by the time this episode airs, given the fact that these trade wars are so deep and extensive, and the fact that our current president is choosing to go most aggressively after our top trading partners, as well as China, it's just almost difficult to wrap one's mind around what is happening and what is the framing that we should use to have a conversation about this. What is your sense of the current state of play? And I know that couldn't be a bigger question.
It is a big question. And as you said, like this whole conversation may be OBE by the time we're finished. But
it could be relevant in 3 weeks too. So
True. It's interesting. Everything feels very herky-jerky and like we're being lurched in every possible direction. But with all of the announcements that have been coming out over the past couple days, and even a little bit longer, including the president's remarks during the State of the Union, I do think there is a trade policy that is becoming clearer and clearer, which is obviously the use of tariffs, but not so much the use of tariffs to extract a concession from Canada or Mexico or China, but more using tariffs in trade policy to really enact a wall around the United States to encourage reinvestment in the U.S., reshoring in the U.S. I'm less and less convinced that all of these tariff actions are geared specifically towards extracting an immigration concession from Mexico, a fentanyl concession from China, or whatever concession from Canada, but that this is part of a larger strategy that will, I think, reveal itself in the coming months, especially as the administration has this April 2nd deadline for, coming up with its actions on trade. But I think all the stuff we're seeing in the last couple of days has been laying the foundations for what's to come.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think to your point, trade and geopolitics have always gone hand in hand. It's actually somewhat reassuring to hear that you think there is a cohesive strategy behind this, because I think one of my fears as an observer from the business side of this is that there isn't a cohesive strategy and that it's emotional and reactive and minute to minute. Like anything with trade policy, there can be unintended consequences. There's a huge effect on investment planning, all of the things that any firm or organization cares about. And at least with a cohesive strategy, it gives you a sense that, okay, if I just tack in this direction, eventually this will kind of come together and like whatever, as opposed to what is happening. And it's just they're at the level of chaos, right? So do you think that people should have a level of, is reassurance like too strong of a word? But does that give you some?
I think it's too strong of a word. I think in the sense, look, it's chaotic right now. And if from a business, it is absolutely impossible to plan anything. If you wake up in the morning and think that 25% tariffs are going to go into effect, and then, 5 hours later, maybe they won't, maybe they will next month. It's been, the past month, really, it's like whiplash.
Yeah.
But I do think that all being said, I think the president's drive towards reciprocal tariffs, which is what his administration will announce in April, will likely clarify, at least for the moment, what they're thinking in terms of rates for different countries. We're in uncharted territory right now. Like, we have never really seen anything like this before, not even with Smoot-Hawley, not even with McKinley tariffs. Like, we're talking tariffs on a vast percentage of trade, and we still don't really know what those contours are. We have a sense with China. I don't think we're done with China. We have a sense with Canada and Mexico. I don't think 25% is the end rate. It'll probably end up being a bit lower at the end of the day, but we just don't know. And if you're a business trying to plan around that, even knowing that like on April 2nd, something is going to come out of the administration that may provide clarity, maybe it won't. I think it's very, very hard to really think as a global business, like where you're going, where your supply chains are, when you really don't know what the rules of the game are yet.
Absolutely. Sometimes when I hear the president talk about this, what I think he's actually getting at sounds a lot like a VAT. It sounds like tax policy, not trade. And obviously there's some crossover implications there. But he's really talking about the revenue collected from it, and the fundamental maybe difference of opinion between casual observer like myself and the president is that those receipts are coming from Americans. Those receipts are not actually coming from China or whoever else, right? Like we know that. Do you think that's part of what's going on? Is this just another way to get at tax policy? Is that what we're doing?
I think yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, as Congress starts to think about making permanent or extending tax cuts, the prospect of using tariff revenue as an offset is something that I think people are talking about and is very real. But when you think about tariffs as a tax, it is a tax, but It's a tax on us as consumers. I think we're crazy if we think that if you're going to impose 25% tariffs on any one country, that it's not going to affect consumers in the short, medium, and long term. Because if you're a business and all of a sudden your inputs are 25% higher, cost you 25% higher, you're either going to eat it, unlikely, or you're going to pass it off to consumers. So, whether you go into a store in a few weeks and see prices of your favorite product from Canada 25% higher, or should tariffs go into effect with Mexico, you'll see tequila 25% higher. You'll see avocados 25% higher. Tomatoes, we are the ones that are going to be paying for it. So there's like tariff revenue as an offset for lower taxes as, one bucket. And then there's tariff as actually being a tax on the U.S. consumer.
Right. And then the additional problem of, your mention of tequila makes me think of the fact that you can't buy Jack Daniels anymore in Canada, because obviously these countries also don't really appreciate how we're going about this and are reacting rapidly and aggressively as well.
Yeah, we do forget about retaliation. We decide to put tariffs up. And of course, as we've seen with Canada, we haven't yet seen what Mexico is planning. We've seen what China wants to do. There is a tit for tat element of any trade war. It's amazing how quickly Canada's provinces move, for example, to remove U.S. alcohol from their shelves. And the Canadian government has said that it's going to put tariffs on a whole slew of trade between the U.S. and Canada, starting now with a smaller percentage, but then increasing to a much larger percentage of trade in the next few weeks. So this is just the beginning.
Right. One other thing that I find kind of interesting is the common theme across these three initial countries seems to be fentanyl, obviously a huge, devastating problem. But the strategy and maybe the intended goal, if you're getting into a darker theory of the case, seems to be a little different country to country. So with Canada, I mean, it really does seem like he is serious about annexing them. Certainly they feel that way based on what their foreign minister said just this week. With Mexico, obviously immigration, nearshoring, we've had long-standing arguments about border security, all the thing, manufacturing. I mean, there's tons of issues. And then China, of course, is just a host of different issues as well as geopolitics. And even the Panama Canal seems to be part of this. Just this week, a Hong Kong billionaire has agreed to sell the controlling interest in the Panama Canal to BlackRock. That's a huge Trump backer. That's a very interesting outcome potentially coming from this. What are the top risks of going so broadly in terms of the strategy, not just the operating mechanics of tariffs or other trade policy?
I think in this case, though, the operating mechanics are important. And here's why. I think what we're seeing right now is filler. I think what we're going to see in April is really the legal basis for imposing tariffs. You can't really just impose tariffs willy-nilly. And the reason why this administration, I think, is using fentanyl is because they're trying to use a provision of U.S. law that allows you to take swift action if there's a national emergency. And so they're calling fentanyl, they're calling, immigration a national emergency. And that's the justification for the actions that they're taking on Canada, Mexico, and China. I think once they have their they've sort of dotted the I's and crossed their T's on what they're going to do using the other trade tools that are much more durable and much less susceptible to legal challenge. I think then you'll kind of see the direction that they're actually heading in. I view a lot of the stuff that we are seeing now as the president promised immediate action upon getting inaugurated. And this is the way to move very quickly on tariffs, is declaring a national emergency, with respect to Canada, Mexico, and China, and taking swift action. The tariffs that he'll likely impose on other trading partners, whether it's India, Vietnam, the EU, Brazil, pick a country, will likely be based on other provisions of U.S. law that will provide, I think, more justification and more durability for what they're trying to do overall. Okay, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. I think that's really, really helpful context. Let's talk a little bit more about what's happening with these two allies. I mean, because that's obviously, to me, probably the most important thing, even though obviously we have a lot of supply chains and China's a large market too. But when you're looking at kind of the dynamic with Canada as a result of this, what is your take on what's happening? Which sectors do you think are most affected?
If you're looking at tariffs to extract a concession from a trading partner, I could sort of see where the administration's view towards Mexico is, particularly with respect to border security, which has been another huge issue for the president. With Canada, it's much harder to see, and the disruption is really going to be quite extensive. I mean, we have such an integrated trade and economic relationship with Canada. Look at every sector. Look at autos. Look at agriculture. Look at wood products. Look at machinery. It's everywhere with Canada. And it's, I think, naive to think that imposing 25% tariffs on one of your closest trading partners is not going to have a negative effect on the U.S. economy, especially when you consider that that economy is also retaliating against you. So you have lots, I think, danger for the U.S. agriculture sector. I think you have lots of danger, as you've already seen with the emptying of the shelves with U.S. alcohol. There's just a lot of collateral damage that this could cause. Now, who knows? By the time we're done with this call, the president may have decided to delay implementation of tariffs on Canada, as he's already done with Mexico, to give a little bit more time to kind of, figure this out. But it's very concerning.
Absolutely. And what is your advice to firms that have tight partnerships and in Canada, operations, supply chain, the works?
I mean, this is not a surprise, right? Like, the president has been talking about tariffs since his first term. So companies, in theory, should have been prepared for the possible eventuality. If you're doing a risk analysis as a company, you should have your various scenarios. If this happens, then we do this. If that happens, then we do that. The scenario planning for companies, if they haven't done it already, I think that's absolutely critical because we're literally at the beginning of this. And where we're going to be in another 4 years is going to be a very different place. Should the direction of travel continue to be erecting piece by piece a sort of tariff fortress around the United States.
So before we get into Mexico, let me ask you a question that's actually a little bit more big picture. And that is, I agree with you on the scenario planning. However, I don't think that anyone thought, again, that it would be as wide and deep. I don't think people, and maybe we were naive, but I don't think people expect as much of the on-off with like just the level of, the up and down of this. And the velocity, I think, is pretty surprising. If you were advising the board of, you're still at Visa or another firm, like how are you supposed to look at this from a strategic oversight perspective?
Again, it's like you have to game it all out. You have to game out the future, but that doesn't answer your question about what do you do in the present. I mean,
make this less hard, please.
I know, no, and it's pretty hard to make this less hard. If you're a company and you rely on inputs from a country on which the United States is placing 25% tariff, I mean, that could be make or break for you. So what do? Do you go in and have a strategy with the administration to try to petition for an exemption? That's probably what I would do, and explain why your particular product that you're importing into the United States from Canada, Mexico, China, you can really only get from there. And without that input, it's causing, undue harm to you as a company. I mean, you really have to think about every possible leverage point in order to try to stave off, delay, minimize the disruption that a disruption in supply chains caused by, 25%, 20%, whatever percent tariffs is going to cause your business.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And to your point, and you also have to deal with the fact that consumer demand may fall off. There may be other implications. Now we have, very likely going to see rising inflation, maybe stagflation. I don't know. So maybe moving along before we get too dark into that spiral. What about your take on Mexico? Obviously, just before we started recording, it looks like we're holding off on tariffs for another month when it comes to Mexico. What is your sense of this situation versus Canada?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think there's probably a bit of personal dynamic between the leaders that affects the outcome here. I think Canada has taken a very strong reaction, which may have poked the bear a little bit, understandably from their own sort of domestic political reasons. I think Mexico has taken much more, like China in a sense, a bit more of a wait and see and a more deliberate approach. Mexico hadn't announced any retaliation against the U.S. I think the president of Mexico, she was planning to make an announcement on March 9th, but now she doesn't have to because tariffs have been staved for another month. So I do think part of it is, the very nature of just global geopolitics and how well leaders get on. I can't really think of another reason because the integration of the North American market, whether it's Canada, the U.S., or Mexico, I mean, it's an integrated market, however you slice it. I mean, you look at the level of imports that come into the United States from Canada and Mexico, it's 30%. It's a lot. And so I guess we'll see. I think if the Mexico situation is any indication, maybe there will be a relaxation for Canada as well. And possibly the reason why we haven't seen it yet is, again, the dynamics, and the administration maybe just to stir the pot a little bit more with Canada before it delays for another month. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting that the personalities are so different in addition to the countries and the markets being so different. Speaking of another massive market, China has, responded pretty aggressively just this week. I do agree that initially you think they almost seem like they're a little more used to this dance given the round of tariffs from the first administration. But this time around, they reacted pretty aggressively towards top allies of the president. They went after ag, ranchers, energy producers, car makers. And at the same time, they're ramping up defense spending, which obviously causes issues for us in different ways that doesn't seem like we're fully thinking through some of those ramifications. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, there is this interesting dynamic about the Panama Canal and control of ports and shipping that seems to be part of the undertone. The other piece of news that I thought was so interesting was that the president announced this week that TSMC is going to have a huge investment in the United States, and that is causing consternation in Taiwan. This is obviously your region. You have tons of knowledge about this. So with that set up, what is happening with China? What do you think is happening that we might not be fully appreciating from the outside looking in?
It's interesting, Neetha. I think that China has actually been pretty measured in its reaction. And I think you're right. I think China really learned from the first Trump term, as they were the target and will continue to be the target in this term. I think China has really refined its playbook in terms of dealing with the threat of a trade war. And it's not just a tit-for-tat tariff retaliation. China's developed its unreliable entities list. It has, taken action against certain U.S. companies from an antitrust perspective. It has, barred certain export controls in addition to tariffs. And so with each announcement that now this administration has had with China, you've seen an announcement, a response, an announcement, a response. But there's a lot more that China can do to really damage the trade relationship. And what I think China is thinking is they don't want to go full on because they think that the president may be interested in doing a deal. And they don't want to spoil that possibility yet. I think they're keeping their powder dry. They're biding their time. They're hoping, like they tried to negotiate in the first Trump administration, remember the phase one agreement, some sort of grand bargain that will address U.S. concerns, address China's concerns. But with each salvo that's fired, it becomes harder and harder to do that. So right now, we are where we are with China. The 10% announcement was the first announcement, another additional 10%. I anticipate there's going to be more action directed at China in the maritime sector, whether it's on steel, whether it's additional tariffs, like higher level tariffs on Chinese products. I think it's going to get harder and harder and harder to create the space to negotiate the kind of deal that the president may want to do as this kind of trade war escalation tit for tat continues.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, that'll be one we might come back to you for your analysis on that, because that's
And the other thing, Neetha, too, is like there's the economics, right? But don't forget like the politics of China, too. Remember the balloon.
Right, yep.
I mean, everything seemed to be sort of getting back into place with the U.S.-China relationship. And then the spy balloon flew over and the relationship went into a tailspin. It doesn't take a lot with China to have something really derail the relationship. And this administration has a nearly unanimous view on China, which is way more hawkish than it may have been in President Trump's first term. I think that one of the biggest geopolitical risks I see sort of going forward in the next few years really is the U.S.-China relationship. Maybe the two sides can keep it managed and prevent it from going off rails. But one little thing I think can really throw this, whether it's a trade issue or some kind of security issue, Taiwan, et cetera, can really have this very much off balance.
So interesting with China is the level of opacity, right? Today, given the fact that we basically have virtually no Western journalists even operating there, a lot of people who used to do business and go in country are no longer doing that. There's just a level of engagement that we no longer have. So I also wonder how you would even know what might set it off in the way that you would before. When you were in the seat, I think you had a much clearer sense of, if I do this, here's what's likely to happen. That scenario planning was tighter. So it feels like we're playing with fire in a way that the unintended consequences may not be what you wanted.
Absolutely. I think criticize sort of past engagement with China. And there's a lot to criticize, but there was ongoing, very frequent dialogue. And so you definitely had, at all levels of government, at the highest level, at mid-levels, all the different agencies had their own sort of track of dialogue with China. And, the criticism of that is that dialogue doesn't really go anywhere. But on the flip side, dialogue actually helps manage things when things really do go off rails. And I don't know who the backstop is on the Chinese side or on the U.S. side right now. Should some spy balloon type of an issue pop up, I don't know who's going to actually is going to pick up the bat phone and call their counterpart across the Pacific. And that's very dangerous because without having some sort of normalized channel to address flare-ups really have the possibility to spiral out of control.
Right. Well, another wild card in this mix is Russia. It's a country that, seemingly overnight has gone from being a significant adversary to someone that certainly the president seems to have a lot of affection for. I also wonder how that changing dynamic affects China, because obviously China and Russia have been allies. And again, if the U.S. treatment is so differentiated between the two, one wonders what the implications of that are. What do you think is going on? We're talking about undoing sanctions and enabling American companies to reinvest in Russia. I mean, there's a lot that's changing pretty quickly. At the same time, we don't have a resolution to the war that Russia started in Ukraine, and serious and very understandable concerns, in my view, from the Europeans about what is going on with NATO and global security. I mean, to not overstate the matter.
Nita, it strains credulity when you think about how this is affecting Ukraine.
Right.
But if you were to think about this from a China perspective, and why on earth would this administration want to sort of cozy up to Russia? If you view it through the lens of China hawks, the war in Ukraine, the conflict with Russia is a distraction. And that's an awful thing to say, and I don't believe that. But I could see how if you're really focused on the U.S.-China relationship as being the most important thing, China being the most important strategic competitor to the United States, trying to sort of clear the decks so that U.S. policy can focus exclusively on China. And how do you peel away countries that are aligned with China right now, whether it's Russia or others? I think there's an element to that in the administration's thinking. The consequences are tragic when you think about, sort of abandoning Ukraine, after what it's been through, after it's been invaded, after, you have a ruler who's just trying to negate the existence of a democratically elected government and of a people. But if you view this through the exclusive lens of China being the biggest strategic competitor to the United States, that's possibly a reason that's animating the sort of pivot that we're seeing towards a different relationship with Russia.
I see the argument you're making. I can understand that. I think it's fascinating, though, because obviously for the Europeans, this is existential, as it is for Ukraine. It's existential for Ukraine above anyone else. But at the same time, the Europeans, rightfully so, cannot ignore this issue. And this is not the way I would go about it. It is forcing them to take on more of their security and defense spending and, a whole host of things that have not been moving along maybe as quickly as more hawkish stakeholders would have liked. I get that. It just seems like this is a lot of friction to add to getting people to do what you might want them to do.
It's a lot of needless friction. The whole invasion of Ukraine galvanized the U.S. and its NATO allies in a way that we probably haven't seen in our lifetimes. Yeah. And a lot of the complaints and, in many cases, legitimate concerns that Europe wasn't spending enough on its defense were in the process of being addressed. And the fear now is that we fracture, and we are fracturing in a way that undermines the actual goal that I think everyone shares. So anyway, this has been, for me, I think, just personally, the element of the administration's policy that's been the most problematic. I don't agree with the direction on tariffs, but that's just a policy difference. I don't think tariffs are a tool to accomplish some of the things that the administration does. That's my own personal policy view. That the Ukraine-Russia thing is a level of feeling about abandoning a very, very close ally and partner after we've sort of seen this movie before in the last century. It's a bit heartbreaking for me as an American to be watching this.
Oh, I feel the same. I absolutely agree. It's a sovereign democratic country, an ally. It has wider implications. I feel the same. It's just so disappointing in this whole, in just all of this, and kind of back to that trade and geopolitics, is all of the economic prosperity that we do have has come from growing the pie, from creating more opportunities for more connection, collaboration. I know these are like all turning into fuzzy words now, but that is true. And that's just where it's all come from. None of it came from us building higher, thicker walls. And so it's disappointing to kind of see this is the direction that we seem to be taking right now.
It is disappointing. And like pivoting back to trade, what's interesting, Nita, I think, is you're right. Like the whole post-World War II order was about dismantling barriers between countries. And on the trade side, the crowning achievement was the creation of the World Trade Organization, which was finally binding the world to a set of rules that if everybody followed, life was just going to be great. The problem that we've seen, unfortunately, is that not all countries who join the WTO abide by the rules. And so if one large, country, China, for example,
I was going to say, are we going to name it? Yeah. Sure.
Isn't playing by the rules, or if the rules that were negotiated back in the late 80s and early 90s don't cover the types of trade distortions that a large state-controlled economy like China puts into the global trading system, all of a sudden the rules that we've been living by and the philosophy that we've been living by for the past, 50, 60 years kind of comes crashing down around us. And you're sort of left. And I give this administration, I don't know if credit is the right word, they're taking a whole different approach to this now, because in their view, this just hasn't worked and in large part, they're right. It hasn't worked as conceived because there have been distortions that we didn't know were going to, be in existence when the rules were created. So now we're throwing the rules out and are trying to create something new. I don't know if that's the right approach, but there definitely is a compelling argument to be made that the current system that we've created needs some serious overhaul.
Yeah, I think that's a compelling argument. I agree with you. Do you think then that it's possible we're going to correct some of what is lacking in the WTO inadvertently, again, in a really chaotic manner, but is it possible that we actually get a good outcome?
I am sort of pessimistically optimistic in the sense that
I love that.
I don't think, let's see what happens in the course of the next couple months. I don't think this administration, I think this administration may engender so much mistrust among the countries that it would need to do it with, that it may not be in the position to be able to actually put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It could very well be that, whatever future administration comes in 4 years and kind of sees whether it's like a wreckage or whatever it is in 4 years, there may be the impetus then to really pick up the pieces with our like-minded trading partners and construct something new that's kind of more appropriate to the challenges that today's global economy faces, which are just very different from what we faced in 1945.
Right. And speaking of new, in February, the president issued 2 key memos. One was about foreign investment and the other was about digital trade. A lot of interesting items in this one. One of the provisions basically creates a whitelist for allies, which I do think a lot of people feel like that's a good thing to do in concept. And as a result of being on that whitelist, you wouldn't have to go through CFIUS review, which can be pretty onerous. What's your take on this? Do you like that concept? Are there some things that you think are positive in this approach?
I do. I do. I think that these trade memos, the one on investment and then the one on the digital services taxes, they're different from sort of where the administration is going on tariffs, I think. On the investment one, to me, that memorandum is all about national security. It's all about the relationship between investment and national security. And it's not something, quite frankly, I think that the U.S. has gotten fully right yet. When I read this memo, it's basically saying, good countries, our allies, people that we trust, will have an expedited way of investing in the United States versus countries that we don't trust. We're not going to be as open of an investment environment as we may have been in the past. And that memo really does look at outbound investment from the United States too. So, the Biden administration was actively looking and acting on this as well. But if you're a U.S. company, should you be investing in a technology that the Chinese government is going to use for military purposes? Maybe not. And so I think this investment memo is very sort of thought-provoking, and from a policy perspective, hopefully will focus minds on figuring out what the ideal investment regime in the U.S. should be. In this era of significant national security and cyber challenges, it probably makes sense to be more restrictive on who can invest in the United States and what companies, U.S. companies, should be investing in. Should they be investing in companies that are going to ultimately threaten the national security of the United States? Probably not. So I actually think the investment memo is something that is very worthy of a lot of thought and discussion and action. The digital services tax memo, we have had a longstanding challenge in the EU, in Canada, in India, and other countries that have digital services taxes because they are viewed, and probably rightfully so, as being a disproportionate burden to large U.S. tech companies. And, it has been an issue for a while. And I think this memo is an effort by the administration to focus minds on, this, although it's not a tariff barrier, could be seen as burdensome and restrictive to U.S. tech exports. And so I do think this will somehow feature into how the administration looks at trade barriers that are not tariff barriers, that are, non-tariff trade barriers.
To that point, AI remains a pretty huge point of contention, particularly with China. And the DeepSeek controversy of the last few weeks, I think, has really crystallized that arms race effectively. One of the memos is very focused on export controls in particular. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Again, trade and national security were always kind of seen as very separate things. Right. And maybe they were, which is funny, but they're so integral. And you can't really, I think the lesson that we've learned over the past decade, maybe 15 years, is you really cannot separate trade from foreign policy, from national security. They're very interwoven, and there are trade tools to use to address national security challenges, whether they're export controls, whether they're sanctions. There are things that we can do as a government to help, buttress our own national security that may be, an export control or some form of trade restriction. I think that in this day and age where national security challenges really sometimes reign paramount, looking at trade and national security as cousins rather than as two things that have nothing to do with each other makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Do you think then that the U.S. should expand oversight, not just of tech investments, but also things like supply chain and other ancillary issues that are more integral and are integrated in ways that, as DC people, we're used to kind of seeing, I think, these things in silos. And I don't think that's how adversaries or even allies necessarily look at it. It's not how business looks at it. What do you think about that?
I agree with you 100%. And I do think this investment memo is kind of an effort to do that, following up on what the Biden administration had done in this area as well. Let's take a holistic look at U.S. investment policy and think about where are the national security implications, and do we have the tools to make sure that an investment next to a nuclear facility isn't going to lead to some kind of long-term cyber challenge, for example. So I do think looking at this kind of I mean, I hate the expression a whole of government, but in this case, taking sort of like a whole of government approach to U.S. investment policy makes a heck of a lot of sense.
Looking ahead, this has been super helpful. I know this has been a very wide-ranging conversation, but I think it will be really helpful to people. And so as we look ahead, how do you think businesses, and particularly the board, how should businesses be trying to synthesize all of this? And what do you think that they should do differently versus how they've historically looked at strategic planning and scenario planning and all those things?
I hate to say this because I find it fascinating, but you could say trade had been boring for many, many years. And as a result, there was a complacency that set in that was sort of like, there is a direction of travel, which is tariffs are going to go down, non-tariff barriers are going to go down. And so as a board or as the risk committee on the board, trade wasn't really seen as like a big risk. It is now top three risks, and having to readjust kind of the way a company thinks about geopolitics, the way a company thinks about global supply chain. COVID made things very unpredictable, obviously, but we are now in an era that we've never really seen before. And having sort of the mechanisms in place in a company to be able to scenario plan trade risks. I mean, I don't think I ever would have said that, use those words like in one sentence, but it's critical. It's absolutely critical now, as we've seen over the course of the last, 6 weeks. And as we're going to see over the course of the next 4 years on trade, businesses have to be prepared. Otherwise, it's creating challenges in addition to the challenges that you're getting from the external environment.
Are there any other misconceptions that you think are not well understood that you think stakeholders should focus on in this moment?
It's funny, Neetha. Again, like putting on the trade nerd hat. I think like the biggest misconception, there's two misconceptions. One misconception follows the next misconception. So for so many years, and I'm guilty of this, there was the misconception that trade and open borders is an unmitigated good. And there was efforts when companies would come in and complain about problems they were having in foreign markets. You just thought that, if we open up, if we do more, things will get better. And that was a misconception. Now the misconception is trade is an unmitigated bad, and that you want to just, shelter yourself. And that's the best way to sort of conduct economic policy. They're both wrong. And I think it's very important and imperative upon, policymakers, folks in think tanks, academics, businesses to start thinking about the paradigm that actually really does make sense. Fully open, as we were thinking about when the WTO came into effect, doesn't work for the reasons that we've seen, given the entry of China into the global trading system. Fully closing down, that's never really worked either. There's the danger of inflation, there's a danger of GDP contraction. So neither paradigm is the right paradigm. And I think what we need to do, really think very hard about is how do you strike the balance between being as open as you possibly can while addressing the very real challenges that subsidies, national security challenges, et cetera, place on the global trading system.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. We need to be more strategic, both as the government and within organizations, and nimble too, because there is this, I think the one thing that I'm struck by is, in the 45 days of this new administration is the one thing to their credit is they are moving really quickly. If you are aligned with them, you're probably delighted at the rate of change. I think it's bewildering and concerning to many of us, and I include myself in that list, but there is something to the rapidity of it, which meets the moment and fits in more with the pace of modern life. I think there's something in that. Let's leave people with one topic of optimism. What do you think that organizations should consider that might be positives coming out of all of this?
So I think it's an excellent question because, tariffs and trade restrictions, it's negative. It's reacting to something in a way that sort of closes things down. But I do think, that being said, I do think that there will be opportunities in this administration, and businesses should look to where are the pockets of goodwill between this administration and other countries. I think the UK is a very good example of this. Prime Minister Starmer had a great visit last week. The last Trump administration launched free trade agreement negotiations with the UK. This is an opportunity to actually create rules that fit today's economy and may not be relevant to trade between the US and the UK, but could be very relevant to constructing whatever comes next. And I think if I were this administration and I were, pursuing reciprocal tariffs, and I would want to think of an area where businesses can get excited about something to, look forward to, and something that would be helpful to them, in part to counter the negative economic implications that building a tariff wall around the United States would do. I think the UK is a bright spot. I think Africa is a bright spot. The last Trump administration had begun free trade agreement negotiations with Kenya. The massive potential that we always talk about with respect to sub-Saharan Africa is yet unrealized. If this administration is again thinking exclusively through the lens of China, having more US engagement in sub-Saharan Africa is a place that checks a lot of boxes. It's a huge business opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to spread sort of American goodwill and peel, countries that may otherwise be associated with China into sort of like the US orbit. So I do think there are bright opportunities out there. And I do think that if I were this administration, I would want to think about what would be the counterbalance to kind of the negative elements of pursuing a very aggressive maximalist tariff policy.
Demetrios, thank you so much for joining us. I knew you'd be amazing. You always have so many thoughtful and helpful pieces of information and analysis to share. So thank you so much for joining us today.
It was so much fun, and thank you for having me.
Love it. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, leave us a review, subscribe to the show, or check out another episode. We appreciate your support.